For as long as I can remember, my mother's words felt like rules written in stone. She spoke with confidence, the kind that made questions feel unnecessary. When she told me how to behave, what to tolerate, and what to ignore, I listened without hesitation. I believed that listening meant love, and obedience meant respect. In our home, emotions were not something to dwell on. Crying was seen as weakness, not release. Complaining was considered ungrateful, not honest. Whenever I struggled, my mother would remind me that life was hard and no one would carry my burdens for me. "You have to be strong," she'd say. At the time, I thought strength meant doing everything alone. So I learned to quiet myself. I stopped asking for comfort because I didn't want to seem needy. I learned to hide disappointment behind a polite smile. When something hurt me, I convinced myself it wasn't worth mentioning. I told myself that enduring pain silently made me mature, admirable, worthy. My mother wasn't unkind. She worked tirelessly, sacrificed endlessly, and gave what she could in the only way she knew how. But tenderness was rare, and reassurance even rarer. Love, in her world, was expressed through duty, not warmth. As a child, I accepted that without question. I became the easy one, the child who didn't ask for much, who adapted quickly, who never caused trouble. I learned to read the room, to sense when it was better to stay quiet. I believed my needs were secondary, something to deal with privately. Without realizing it, I began shaping myself around absence. I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't know how to set boundaries. I didn't know how to say, "This hurts me." Whenever doubt crept in, my mother's voice would rise above my own. "Don't be dramatic. Don't make things harder than they already are." So I swallowed my words and carried on. It never occurred to me that some lessons, when taught without gentleness, can slowly erase a child's sense of self. I trusted her completely. After all, she was my mother. I didn't know then that one day, I would have to unlearn the very things I was taught to survive. When I stepped into adulthood, I thought I was prepared. My mother had warned me enough life was unfair, people were unreliable, and no one would come to save me. I believed I understood what that meant. What I didn't realize was how deeply I had trained myself to disappear just to survive. The world didn't challenge my silence. It welcomed it. At work, I was the one who stayed late without complaint, who fixed problems quietly, who accepted extra responsibility without recognition. I told myself this was professionalism. In truth, I was afraid of being seen as difficult. I believed my value came from how much I could endure without asking for more. In friendships, I listened more than I spoke. I showed up even when I was exhausted. I gave advice, support, and understanding, yet rarely received the same in return. When people disappointed me, I excused them. When they crossed boundaries, I blamed myself for expecting too much. And in love, I carried my mother's lessons like armor. I stayed in situations that made me feel small because I thought leaving meant failing. I accepted emotional distance because I believed needing reassurance was weakness. When I was hurt, I softened my pain into silence, afraid that expressing it would push someone away. I told myself this was strength. But strength began to feel like loneliness. There were moments, quiet ones, usually at night, when I felt an emptiness I couldn't explain. I could be surrounded by people and still feel invisible. I could give everything I had and still feel unchosen. Something inside me kept asking, "Is this all there is?" Whenever that question surfaced, I pushed it down. I reminded myself of my mother's voice. "Life is hard. Don't expect too much. Just get through it." So I did. I survived disappointment after disappointment. I convinced myself that pain was normal, that exhaustion was proof of effort, that feeling unseen was simply part of growing up. But the truth was harder to face. I wasn't struggling because I was weak. I was struggling because I had never learned how to protect myself. I had been taught how to endure, not how to demand better. Slowly, I began to notice a pattern not just in my life, but in hers. The same quiet sacrifices, the same unspoken resentment, the same tired acceptance. And for the first time, a frightening thought crossed my mind. What if this wasn't strength at all? What if this was simply survival, passed down like an inheritance no one ever questioned? It took time, more time than I want to admit, to stop seeing my mother only as my parent and start seeing her as a person. Not the woman who raised me, but the woman who lived before me. The woman who learned to survive long before she learned how to feel. I began to notice the cracks in her strength. She never rested without guilt. Even on days when her body was clearly tired, she kept moving, as if stopping meant something terrible would happen. She rarely asked for help, and when she did, it was wrapped in apology. She dismissed her own pain quickly, the way someone does when they've learned no one is really listening. And suddenly, her lessons made sense. She hadn't taught me silence because she believed it was right. She taught it because it was familiar. She hadn't discouraged emotions because she thought they were useless. She discouraged them because no one had ever made space for hers. My mother grew up learning that softness was dangerous, that depending on someone meant giving them power to hurt you, that survival required thick skin and low expectations. So she adapted. She endured. She hardened herself and called it strength. And without realizing it, she handed that same armor to me. I don't think she knew she was passing down fear. I think she believed she was protecting me, preparing me for disappointment, teaching me how not to break. But protection without tenderness becomes another kind of harm. By the time I understood this, I was already carrying the weight of lessons I never asked for. I had already learned to ignore my instincts, minimize my needs, and doubt my feelings. I had already confused self-denial with maturity. There was grief in that realization. Grief for the child I had been, the one who learned too early how to be quiet. Grief for the conversations we never had, the reassurance she never knew how to give. Grief for the version of myself I might have become if I had been taught that my feelings mattered. And yet, alongside that grief, something else emerged. Understanding. My mother wasn't cold. She was conditioned. She wasn't distant. She was afraid. And in her own imperfect way, she loved me with the only tools she had. That truth didn't erase the impact of her lessons, but it softened my anger. It helped me see that the harm wasn't intentional, it was inherited. Still, understanding didn't undo the damage. It only made one thing painfully clear. If I didn't question these lessons now, I would carry them forever. And one day, I might pass them on, believing I was doing the right thing, just like she did. That thought stayed with me. Heavy, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. And slowly, it pushed me toward a choice I could no longer avoid. The most powerful lessons my mother taught me were never said out loud. They lived in her routines, her exhaustion, the way she accepted less than she deserved and called it responsibility. I didn't learn them from her advice. I learned them by watching her life unfold. She carried everything alone, even when she didn't have to. She put herself last so often that it became habit. Rest, joy, and desire were treated like luxuries she couldn't afford. And slowly, without meaning to, she taught me that self-sacrifice was the price of being needed. For a long time, I followed that example faithfully. I stayed when I should have left. I forgave when I should have protected myself. I explained away behavior that hurt me because I believed understanding someone mattered more than respecting myself. Every time I ignored my own discomfort, I told myself I was being mature, strong, patient. But patience began to feel like erasure. One day, I looked at my life and felt a quiet fear settle in my chest. I saw the same tired patterns, the same emotional hunger, the same silent endurance I had witnessed in my mother. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before. Is this the life I want? That question changed everything. I started noticing how often I apologized for existing, how uncomfortable I felt expressing needs, how guilty I became whenever I chose myself. None of it felt natural, it felt learned. So I began I spoke up, even when my voice shook. I said no, even when it made me uncomfortable. I allowed myself to disappoint others instead of constantly disappointing myself. Each small act of self-respect felt like rebellion. At first, it was terrifying. I worried I was becoming selfish, cold, ungrateful. My mother's teachings echoed in my mind, warning me not to make life harder than it already was, but I was already struggling. The difference now was that I was finally honest about it. I learned that strength doesn't mean carrying everything alone. It means knowing when to put something down. I learned that love doesn't require suffering. And I learned that being kind to myself didn't make me weaker, it made me real. In breaking away from her example, I wasn't rejecting my mother. I was choosing to end a cycle she never had the chance to escape. That realization hurt, but it also gave me clarity. Because sometimes, the most important lesson a parent teaches isn't how to live. It's what must be done differently. For a long time, I believed healing meant undoing the past, erasing the lessons that hurt me, pretending they never shaped who I became. But I've learned that healing isn't about forgetting, it's about choosing what to keep. My mother taught me many things too late. Not because she failed, but because she never had the chance to learn them herself. And once I understood that, something in me softened. I no longer see her only through the lens of what she couldn't give me. I see her as a woman who survived a life that demanded too much from her and offered too little in return. A woman who did her best with limited tools and carried her pain quietly so I wouldn't have to see it. I forgive her not because the lessons didn't hurt, but because holding on to anger keeps me tied to the very patterns I'm trying to leave behind. But forgiveness doesn't mean repetition. I choose a different path now. I allow myself to feel without shame. I ask for help without apology. I rest without guilt. I set boundaries even when it's uncomfortable. I walk away from situations that require me to disappear in order to belong. These choices still feel unfamiliar at times. Old habits don't fade easily. There are moments when my mother's voice echoes in my head, telling me to endure, to stay quiet, to accept less. But now, I answer back with kindness and with courage. I remind myself that strength can be gentle, that love can be safe, that I don't have to earn rest by suffering first. The lesson my mother taught me too late doesn't end with regret. It ends with intention. I carry forward her resilience, but I leave behind her silence. I honor her sacrifices, but I refuse to inherit her pain. I take what served me and release what didn't. And maybe that is the truest form of love, learning from the past without living in it. This is my story. Not of blame, but of becoming.